The heavy, mirrored doors of the Federal Security Complex lobby parted at precisely the moment I reached the restricted access point. I saw him immediately, my father, Harold Stone, standing with the site's head of security, his hand outstretched in the kind of self-important handshake that had defined his entire life. He was exactly as I remembered. Tailored charcoal suit, silver cufflinks catching the afternoon light, that expensive cologne preceding him like an invisible throne. I was only there to pick up the last box of my technical notebooks. Inside that box lay the final physical reminders of 18 years of brilliance, of sleepless nights spent writing encryption protocols so sophisticated they become industry legend, of work I had been forced to abandon without explanation or severance. Just papers and memories of a life that was no longer mine. But the moment my father's eyes locked onto mine, something shifted in the air between us. I saw it first, that brief, electric flash of panic crossing his face. It lasted only a fraction of a second before the fear crystallized into something colder, harder, more vicious. Contempt. Pure, unfiltered contempt. He didn't hesitate. Without breaking his gaze from mine, he looked toward the stern uniformed guard stationed by the metal detector and gave what I would later understand was his final, public declaration of war. "Don't worry about him, officer," my father barked, his voice carrying loud enough for a dozen important-looking clients nearby to pause and listen. "He's just a civilian. He doesn't belong here anymore." The word civilian was spat out like a curse. Like the ultimate insult. Like I was a nothing, a nobody, a man who had suddenly become less than the security guard he was speaking to. I felt the guard's eyes shift toward me, a mixture of pity and embarrassment that burned hotter than any flame. My chest seized up. The box in my hand seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Around us, conversations stuttered and died. Heads turned. My father had just dismissed 18 years of my professional existence to a stranger, and he'd done it deliberately, publicly, with the precision of a man who'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that this moment would become the hinge upon which everything turned. My name is Caleb Stone, and I am 37 years old. This is a story about betrayal, certainly. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when a man discovers that the only way to reclaim his life is to build something so intricate, so perfectly calibrated, that it can dismantle everything his enemy holds dear. I was the foundation of StoneGuard Elite, my family's security firm. For nearly 2 decades, I had written the encryption code and designed the impossible-to-hack protocols that made the Stone name synonymous with brilliance in the cybersecurity world. Our clients included Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and tech giants who trusted us with their most sensitive information. But my father, Harold Stone, had always harbored a different vision for the company. He'd never built anything himself. He was a salesman, a charmer, a man who understood the art of the handshake better than he understood the architecture of a firewall. Yet he controlled everything, including the future of StoneGuard Elite. My brother Arthur embodied everything my father valued: polished charm, inherited confidence, zero actual substance. Arthur could walk into a boardroom and convince anyone of anything, despite knowing nothing about encryption, nothing about protocols, nothing about the work that actually mattered. He was a beautiful vessel filled with expensive air. But Arthur was Harold's son in the ways that mattered. In appearance, in ambition, in the hunger for power without the willingness to do the work. So when my father looked at StoneGuard Elite, he saw not the company I had built, but the stage upon which Arthur would perform his inheritance. I should have seen it coming. In hindsight, the warning signs were everywhere, written in the subtle shifts of responsibility, in the meetings I was suddenly excluded from, in the way my father began describing my work as legacy rather than current. The moment of real betrayal came 2 years before that day in the lobby. I'd brought the firm its biggest client ever, a contract worth millions of dollars annually. It had taken me 3 years of meticulous work, technical demonstrations, and trust building to secure it. I remember the night of the announcement. My father threw a celebration dinner at his favorite restaurant, the kind of place where the martinis cost more than most people's shoes. During dinner, flush with success and perhaps more confidence than wisdom, I finally asked for what I'd been building toward my entire career: formal recognition as Chief Technical Officer. Not as a title, I'd been doing the work for years, but as acknowledgement, as legitimacy, as proof that my contributions actually mattered. My father listened to my request with the expression of a man listening to someone ask permission to breathe. Then he set down his martini with deliberate precision and laughed. Not a warm laugh. A laugh designed to wound. "CTO is Arthur's destiny, Caleb," he said, leaning back in his Italian leather chair, the kind of chair that cost more than my annual salary. You're too emotional for leadership. You worry too much about silly details. You're unstable. I remember the exact temperature of the room in that moment. I remember how the conversation at the adjacent table suddenly seemed very far away. I remember my wife, Vivian, reaching across the table to touch my arm, her eyes widening with warning or sympathy, I was never quite sure which. My father used my occasional normal work stress as proof that I was mentally weak. It was a classic gaslighting technique, one I would later recognize as the manipulative masterwork it was. He positioned my attention to detail, the very thing that had built the company, as evidence of instability. He reframed my legitimate concerns about protocol compliance as emotional fragility. Within weeks, he had stripped me of my equity. He left me with a severance package that was essentially worthless, calculated with the precision of a man who'd clearly consulted a lawyer specifically about how low he could go. And then he forced me to sign a non-compete clause so comprehensive that it effectively blocked me from using my own expertise, my own knowledge, my own genius against him. He didn't just fire me. He destroyed me strategically, methodically, and with the cold precision of someone who'd planned it down to the final detail. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of debt, financial, emotional, and psychological. My wife, my beautiful, talented wife Vivian, who had dreamed of opening a small bakery, watched that dream evaporate as our savings went to paying rent and keeping us afloat. My existence had become a daily struggle against shame. I watched Vivian work double shifts at a catering company, her hopeful smile fading a little more each week as we used her meager income just to pay the apartment rent. Her hands, which should have been kneading dough and creating beautiful pastries, were instead scrubbing dishes in industrial kitchens. Every morning she left before dawn. Every night she returned after dark, too exhausted to do more than collapse into bed. I had been reduced to taking a low-level technical support job at a local accounting firm. My responsibilities consisted of checking printers, resetting passwords, and fixing IT problems that any apprentice could solve in their sleep. I, who had once designed encryption systems for nuclear facilities, now spent my days explaining to accountants how to restart their computers. The irony was suffocating. Absolute. Unbearable. I could have secured a nuclear silo with 3 lines of code and a 15-minute consultation. I could have designed security protocols for the CIA. But I couldn't secure my wife's small business dream. I couldn't even secure our financial stability. The injustice was a physical thing, a heavy, aching pressure that never left my chest. It lived there day after day like a second heartbeat made of rage and despair. I felt like I was constantly letting Vivian down, constantly confirming my father's diagnosis. I was unstable. I was a failure. I was, as he'd so elegantly put it, just a civilian. I began to understand that I was drowning in a particular kind of hell, the hell of knowing exactly what I was capable of and being powerless to prove it. I kept everything inside. I didn't tell Vivian about the dreams I was having, the ones where I walked back into Stoneguard and everyone was standing in the rubble of what they'd built without me. I didn't tell her about the moments I'd spend staring at my old code, the protocols I'd written, knowing they were still operating somewhere in the world under my brother's name. I didn't tell her that my father had begun calling me occasionally, just to deliver the kind of casual cruelty that only family can manage. "How's the printer business treating you?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with mock concern. Or, "Arthur and I were just talking about that executive wing contract. Shame you'll never work on anything like that again." Each call was designed to remind me of my irrelevance. But something changed on a Tuesday morning in March, about 6 months after I'd been forced out of Stoneguard. I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm, my hand poised over a keyboard, when I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. Not because I was weak, but because continuing to exist in this state would eventually destroy Vivian too. The longer I remained a civilian, a shadow of what I'd been, the more I would pull her down with me. I realized something else in that moment. There was only one way forward. I couldn't rebuild my life until I dismantled the lie that had destroyed it. I couldn't move forward until I forced my father to face the consequences of what he'd done. And I realized, with a clarity that felt almost like divine revelation, that my revenge would need to be strategic, surgical, and absolutely invisible until the final, shocking moment. I quit the accounting job that day. I began my next phase with the precision of a chess master planning 30 moves ahead. I applied for a very specific, low-profile position, technical analyst for a branch of the Federal Protective Service, the FPS. The job seemed designed by fate. It involved reviewing the security compliance of private contractors bidding on major federal projects. It was a massive pay cut. The hours were irregular. The work was bureaucratic and detailed. But the access was priceless. I waited 3 weeks for the federal hiring process to unfold. Background checks, interviews, clearance verification. During those 3 weeks, I told no one what I was doing. Not Vivian, not my mother, not a single soul. This wasn't paranoia. This was necessity. Secrets have a way of traveling, and if my father caught even a whisper of what I was planning, he would find a way to bury it before it could be born. When the acceptance letter came through, I sat alone in my apartment and read it 3 times. Then I printed it, held it to my chest, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes of feeling whatever I was feeling. Relief, rage, hope, hunger for justice. 5 minutes, and then I compartmentalized it all into a locked box in the back of my mind. The FPS office was cramped and smelled of old coffee and the particular mustiness of government buildings everywhere. It was a world away from Stoneguard's polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. But the moment I sat at my government-issued desk and opened my computer, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a genuine rush of power. My new boss was a man named Commander Alpert. He was quiet, methodical, and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that can't be taught. Most importantly, he didn't care about my family name. He didn't know the Stone legacy or Stoneguard elite or any of the politics that had defined my previous life. He only cared about one thing: results. Do your job well, he told me on my first day, and you'll find yourself in rooms where decisions that matter are actually made. I began poring over the fine print of federal contracts with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I studied compliance standards, reviewed technical specifications, analyzed the security proposals of companies bidding for federal projects. And as I did, I became aware of something that made my heartbeat accelerate. Harold's company, built entirely on my genius, was fundamentally, catastrophically vulnerable when measured against the strict, unforgiving compliance standards of the U.S. government. Stoneguard Elite was a house of cards. I had built that house, but I had built it for the private sector, with the complexity and elegance that impressed billionaires and venture capitalists. I had never anticipated that it would need to withstand federal scrutiny. But I had also built something else into Stoneguard Elite years ago, something that would become my secret weapon. My biggest secret lay deep within Stoneguard's infrastructure, buried in code that only I truly understood. Years ago, when I had first designed the company's signature encryption product, the Titan Core Matrix, I had built into it a particular kind of elegance. I designed the system to rely on a complex, dynamic master encryption key that had to be manually updated every 3 months. This wasn't a flaw or an oversight. It was intentional. I had been young then, arrogant in my brilliance, confident in a way that probably should have alarmed me. I had written the code to rely on 7 hidden variables that determined the new encryption key. Only I knew what those variables were. Only I understood the specific mathematical algorithms that would generate each new key. Without those updates, the system would eventually cascade into an irreversible security shutdown. I had built a time bomb into the heart of Stoneguard's most important product, and I had done it deliberately. Why? Because I was brilliant and young and believed, with the absolute certainty of youth, that nothing would ever change between me and my father. I believed I would always be there to maintain it. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about that time bomb. It was still there, still counting down, still waiting for the moment when it would transform from a failsafe into a weapon of exquisite destruction. About 8 months into my FPS position, I was reviewing the details of a minor data leak that had occurred at one of Stoneguard's client offices. The news was being reported as a significant security failure, but I could read between the lines of the technical specifications. The leak hadn't happened because of the Titan Core Matrix. It had happened because of incompetent management at the client level. But there was something else embedded in the incident report, something that made my breath catch. The date stamps on the server logs indicated that the Titan Core Matrix's master encryption key was 5 days overdue for its update. 5 days. My father and brother were running my company into the ground, and they didn't even understand the basic maintenance that would keep it functional. They were patching problems with duct tape and hope, completely unaware that the underlying clock was counting down to 0. I pulled up the televised press conference where Arthur had tried to explain the data leak to the media. He stammered through his explanation, blamed the incident on complex legacy system integration, a description that was technically meaningless, and clearly had no idea what he was talking about. He was a beautiful, empty suit spouting technical jargon he didn't understand. My father stood in the background, his hand on Arthur's shoulder, the picture of paternal pride. He had no idea that his company's most important system was running on fumes. I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The humiliation continued from my father, but it had evolved into something more calculated, more vicious. He called my apartment one evening, his voice thick with threat. "Return the files, Caleb," he said without preamble. "Don't test me. You know what happens to people who cross me." He was referring to a set of old technical schematic drawings that I had kept when I left Stoneguard. These drawings contained my original notes, the true architectural blueprint for the Titan core matrix, including the hidden variables and the mathematics behind them. They were essentially a map of the time bomb I'd built. My father's tone made it clear that this wasn't really about the drawings. He didn't care about them. He was calling because he needed to feel powerful, needed to remind me that he still held authority over something in my life. He was a master of a particular kind of psychological warfare, the kind that leaves no visible marks. I hung up the phone without responding, my hand shaking with a rage so pure and distilled it felt almost like purity. I locked the drawings away in a fireproof safe, then I sat down and wrote them a message I never intended to send. "You taught me that nothing matters except power. You were wrong. What matters is what you do with it." But I didn't send it. I filed it away with everything else I was building. Patience, it turned out, was a virtue I'd never properly cultivated until I needed it most. Then something shifted in the political landscape, and the stakes suddenly became so high they threatened to break through the roof of the building I was working in. Commander Alpert called me into his office on a Thursday morning in late spring. He closed the door behind me, something he'd never done before, and his expression was grave. "We have a major contract opportunity," he said, sliding a classified document across his desk. "The Executive Wing Security Upgrade. Multi-million-dollar project, top-tier government contract. It's been classified, but your clearance level is sufficient. I want you to design the compliance verification matrix for this project." I stared at the document without quite seeing it. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I understood perfectly well. "It means you'll be designing the exact checklist and protocol that any winning contractor must pass. You'll be creating the technical and ethical standards that will determine whether they're capable of handling federal security. You'll essentially be the invisible gatekeeper to this entire project." He leaned forward, studying my face with a particular intensity that made him so good at his job. "This is a big opportunity, Caleb. Whoever wins this contract will be positioned as the nation's premier security firm for the next decade. It's worth hundreds of millions in follow-on business." I nodded slowly, understanding not just what he was saying, but what he wasn't saying. "And one of the bidders will likely be Stoneguard Elite," I said quietly. "Exactly." I felt the room shift. I felt the weight of possibility settle onto my shoulders like a mantle of fate. I was being handed the opportunity to control my father's destiny. I was being asked, essentially, to design the criteria by which he would be judged, and found wanting. "I'll design a CVM that's impossible to fake," I said. "Something that requires genuine technical excellence and absolute system integrity." Commander Alpert smiled, a thin, knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what I was really saying. I expected nothing less. But I realized in the weeks that followed, that my revenge could be more complete than I'd initially imagined. Using my FPS access to collate public records and flight logs, all legal public data, but requiring federal clearance to properly cross-reference, I began an investigation into my father's after-hours activities. I cross-referenced his late-night client dinners with local addresses, tracking his movements with the precision of someone who'd been trained to see patterns in data. What I found was illuminating. A recurring destination emerged, a private, luxury residence owned by Lorraine West, the elegant, socially prominent wife of Senator West. Senator West was, coincidentally, the key political figure sponsoring the executive wing contract. The same contract that my father would be bidding to secure. My father wasn't just having an affair. He was potentially compromising a major government security project for what amounted to a sleazy liaison. I began documenting everything with the meticulousness of an accountant, the precision of an engineer, and the cold focus of a man who understood the value of evidence. I collected dated receipts from restaurants near Lorraine's residence. I gathered flight details showing my father's trips to the city where she lived. I photographed public sightings from society pages and archived them. This wasn't blackmail. It wasn't extortion. It was the ultimate necessary leverage, the kind of leverage that would ensure my father's total social and professional isolation if my technical revenge wasn't quite sufficient. I felt sick doing it in a way that surprised me. I had always imagined myself as someone above this kind of thing. But then I thought about Vivian working double shifts, about the bakery that would never exist, about 18 years of my life being erased as though I'd never mattered at all. The sickness passed. My father's attempts at psychological manipulation intensified during this period, as though he sensed that something was shifting and wanted to maintain his grip on my psyche. He sent Arthur to my apartment with a message that was designed, I understood immediately, to be as insulting as possible. "Dad says you need to see a doctor about your stress," Arthur delivered with smug pity. "You're losing it, Caleb. He'll pay for your first session." It was a calculated insult, suggesting that I was mentally ill for being upset about losing my life's work. It was the ultimate inversion of responsibility, turning my legitimate grievance into evidence of my instability. Arthur delivered the message with the exact combination of pity and condescension that my father had trained him to perfect. He was a beautiful echo of my father's cruelty, a pale imitation of the original, yet still effective enough to land its blow. I closed the door after he left and leaned my head against the wood. I let the rage burn through me like fire, burning away the last scraps of my self-doubt. That rage, I realized, was a gift. It was fuel. It was clarity. In that moment, I stopped viewing this as revenge and started viewing it as reckoning. There was a difference. Revenge is personal and petty. Reckoning is about justice, about consequences, about a world that finally makes sense because people face what they've earned. I was going to give my father exactly what he'd earned. The internal ticking clock of the Titan core matrix was still counting down, inexorably moving toward zero. I knew the final deadline for the key update was only 3 days away, just before Stoneguard would submit their final bid for the executive wing contract. I sent an anonymous, formal email to Stoneguard's IT department, all my former colleagues, people who remembered me, people who likely knew why I'd been pushed out. The email warned them of a critical, unpatched Titan core vulnerability in the legacy system that could result in catastrophic system failure. The message was formal, technical, and absolutely correct. It was impossible to dismiss as incompetence or misunderstanding. They immediately forwarded it to Arthur. Arthur's response was immediate and predictable. "Ignore this. It's fear-mongering from a competitor." His blindness, I realized, was my greatest asset. My father had raised a son who was so confident in his own mediocrity that he couldn't recognize genuine expertise even when it was trying to save him. I had subtly guided weeks ago. Sentinel Security, the only other major firm competing for the executive wing contract. I had provided them with specific information about the vulnerability, framing it as an anonymous whistleblower warning about Stoneguard's core system. Sentinel Security was armed and ready. They had all the ammunition they needed. The countdown had begun. All I had to do now was wait for the cascades to begin. Commander Alpert informed me that the final competitive review for the executive wing contract was set. The process would begin the following week. Stoneguard Elite was one of the 2 finalists. The other was Sentinel Security. Both firms would present their technical plans to a closed-door, high-level panel. Then the final approval would require 3 mandatory signatures from the FPS Compliance Division. 3 people who would verify that the winning contractor met the standards I had designed. I smiled when Alpert told me this because I understood what he was really saying. I was one of the required signatures. I held partial control over my father's destiny. Actually, that wasn't quite accurate. I held complete control over it. I just didn't need to sign my name to anything. The standards I'd designed were impossible to meet if you had a failing encryption system. It didn't matter how good a salesman you were. It didn't matter how famous your name was. It didn't matter who you'd slept with or what political connections you'd cultivated. If you couldn't meet the technical standards, you couldn't win the contract. The day of the closed-door review arrived cold and bright, the kind of spring morning that felt almost mocking in its perfection. I was hidden away in the back of the review room with the other FPS compliance officers. We were essentially witnesses to the presentation, observers of the process rather than active participants. To all appearances, I was just another government employee taking notes on a spreadsheet. My father and Arthur presented first. Harold handled the financials and the vision, an eloquent speech about Stoneguard's history, about legacy and stability and the trust that generations of clients had placed in their name. He was good at this, I had to admit. He was exactly the kind of salesman who could convince a room full of people that tradition mattered more than actual competence. Arthur handled the technical slides, which was immediately a catastrophe. He tripped over the most basic questions about encryption redundancy. He fumbled with technical details that any actual security architect could have explained clearly. His eyes kept darting toward his father for rescue, for guidance, for the reassurance that he actually belonged here. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, a thick, creeping anxiety that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. When one of the panel members asked about the Titan core matrix's proprietary key variables, the exact heart of my work, the core of my genius, the foundation that had made Stoneguard Elite possible, Arthur froze. He started sweating visibly. His voice wavered. He began muttering about complex, outdated code that only one former employee truly understood. The implication was clear. He didn't understand it. He quickly cut himself off, clearly realizing that he'd just acknowledged a gaping weakness. Harold sensed the failure. His body went rigid. He stood up and started shouting about Stoneguard's history, about the firm's reputation, about decades of delivering excellence. He was trying to bully the panel with rhetoric, completely ignoring the technical questions that were the actual point of the review. He was failing and everyone in the room knew it. The panel exchanged glances that I could read clearly. This company wasn't ready for federal-level work. They might have been adequate for private sector clients who cared more about the sales pitch than the actual security, but they weren't adequate for this. The panel moved on to what everyone understood was the final formality, the paperwork. Commander Alpert stood up, and the room shifted into a new register of attention. He passed around the compliance verification matrix, the document I had designed, the blueprint for federal standards that would determine whether a contractor was suitable for the executive wing project. He pointed to the bottom of the last page. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "the final contract requires 3 signatures confirming technical and ethical compliance. These signatures represent the absolute verification that the winning contractor meets every standard outlined in this matrix." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "This final signature," he pointed to the last slot, "requires the sign-off of the chief technical verifier, who must confirm absolute system integrity and complete compliance with federal standards. This person is personally responsible for verifying that the selected contractor can deliver everything promised." Harold, thinking the victory was assured, jumped up immediately. "That signature belongs to Arthur Stone, our chief technical officer," he declared, his voice rising with the confidence of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this moment. "Arthur is fully qualified and certified to provide that verification." He presented Arthur's official company stamp with the kind of flourish that suggested he believed this was the moment where everything would finally lock into place. The CEO of Sentinel Security looked nervous. Arthur leaned back in his chair, clearly believing that he'd somehow dodged the bullet, that the conversation had moved past his humiliating technical presentation into the realm of paperwork and formality. I felt the familiar wave of nausea, the fear that somehow my father would manage to slip through my fingers, would find a way to worm past justice through sheer charm and political connections. Then Sentinel Security made their move. Their CEO, a woman named Michelle Chin who I'd briefly consulted with weeks earlier, stood up with the calm of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Sir," she said, addressing the panel chairman with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, "we believe Stoneguard's bid violates CVM.4.2 as outlined by the FPS technical analyst." The entire room froze. My father's face went pale. Michelle continued, her voice steady. "CVM.4.2 specifies an absolute and immediate failure clause for proprietary encryption systems. If the Titan Core matrix key is not dynamically updated according to the exact specifications outlined in the matrix, a complex and unique process, then the entire system will fail catastrophically. We have documentary evidence that Stoneguard's Titan Core matrix has not been updated according to protocol." She produced the documentation, passing it to the panel. It was information I had provided to her anonymously weeks ago. Information that was technical, verifiable, and absolutely devastating. The room went silent. Harold's face twisted with fury, but he couldn't deny the technical truth. The vulnerability was now public record. It was part of the official review. It was evidence of incompetence that couldn't be explained away with charm or political connections or decades of corporate reputation. "This is nonsense," Harold tried, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Our system is perfectly secure." "Is your master encryption key currently updated?" one of the panel members asked, consulting the documentation. Harold opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Arthur, who looked absolutely terrified. "Our IT department has been managing the updates." "That's not a yes or no answer," the panel member said quietly. "The damage was done. It was already done. The contract decision was suspended until further review. Stoneguard Elite, the company built on my genius and now run by my brother's incompetence, was no longer viable for federal contracts. The contract decision was officially suspended until the Executive Wing Award ceremony, which was scheduled for 3 days later. That night, the night of the deadline for the master encryption key update, the time bomb I'd built years ago finally detonated. The Titan Core Matrix's key expired at exactly midnight. The cascading failure I had constructed years ago, dormant and patient in the code, began its exquisite work. It wasn't dramatic. There were no alarms or explosions. StoneGuard's network didn't crash with a bang. It simply, slowly, silently failed to acknowledge any external connection. The morning after, my brother called me. Hysterical doesn't even begin to describe his voice. It was the sound of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time and realizing they had no tools, no knowledge, no capacity to fix it. "Caleb, you have to help," he practically screamed. "The entire system is down. Clients can't connect. It's catastrophic. This is your fault. You built this disaster." I listened to his frantic voice, devoid of any genuine apology, utterly focused only on the immediate crisis and how he could escape responsibility for it. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for treating you terribly. I'm sorry for not appreciating your work. I'm sorry for letting Dad push you out." He said, "Fix it." And I, calmly, carefully, hung up the phone without saying a word. The next day, I received a thick, formal envelope in my mailbox at the FPS office. Inside was an official invitation to the Executive Wing Award Gala, an elegant, heavy card embossed with the presidential seal in unmistakable gold leaf. It was signed personally by Senator West. He was hosting the event, which meant he was presiding over the announcement of the winning contractor. I held the invitation for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of the cardstock, but the weight of everything that had led to this moment. I smiled. The ultimate tool of revenge was now in my hands. The man whose wife was sleeping with my father had unknowingly invited me to deliver the final blow. There was an elegance to that irony that felt almost poetic. I pinned the invitation on my wall and waited. The day of the Executive Wing Award Gala arrived clear and bright. I dressed carefully in my darkest suit, tailored and professional. I clipped my FPS Technical Verifier badge inside my jacket, close enough that I could reach it, but not so obvious that it would be visible. The badge was a thing of understated beauty, government-issued, official, and embedded with a small but unmistakable rendering of the presidential seal. I arrived at the magnificent government building where the gala was being held, all marble columns and soaring architecture designed to convey permanence and authority. Harold and Arthur were already in the lobby, looking stressed but trying desperately to bluff confidence. Their carefully constructed calm was a facade that might fool people who weren't looking closely. But I was looking closely. Harold saw me and his face hardened immediately. Recognition flashed across his features, not of who I was but of who I represented, a threat to his carefully orchestrated narrative. He didn't hesitate. He ordered the lobby security guard to stop me, his voice carrying the same cold cruelty that I'd heard years ago when he dismissed me as a civilian. "That's fine, officer," he said, his tone suggesting I was barely worth addressing. "He's just a civilian. He has no official business here. Escort him out." The words hung in the air between us, familiar and terrible and perfect. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I didn't move. I didn't resist. I didn't argue or explain or defend myself. I simply looked the guard straight in the eye, reached inside my jacket with deliberate, measured slowness, and pulled out my official FPS Technical Verifier badge. I held it for just a moment, letting the light catch the presidential seal embedded on its surface. That seal glowed gold and unmistakable, a symbol of federal authority that couldn't be questioned or challenged or negotiated away. I clipped it deliberately to my lapel. The sound of my father's breath hitching was thin and weak, the sound of a man's world reorganizing itself around a new reality. I looked at the guard, then back at my father, and I spoke with the full weight of federal authority that I'd earned, and that he'd unknowingly given me the opportunity to claim. "I'm not leaving. I am the chief technical verifier assigned to the compliance verification matrix for the executive wing contract. I am here for the final sign-off." The guard snapped to attention immediately, stepping aside with the respect due to federal authority. My father's face cycled through a dozen emotions: rage, confusion, dawning realization, and finally something that looked like panic. I walked past him without making eye contact, my footsteps echoing across the marble lobby with a kind of inevitability. The auditorium where the award announcement was being made was filled with perhaps 300 people. Corporate executives, government officials, politicians, media representatives. This was a major announcement, and everyone who mattered in the security contracting world was present. Commander Alpert was waiting for me at the entrance to the backstage area. He took one look at me and nodded with the slightest smile. He knew. He'd known all along what this moment would mean. Senator West was on the stage, preparing for the announcement. I could see him scanning the crowd, looking for the key players. My father and Arthur were seated in the front row, still looking shell-shocked by my arrival. I walked directly to the stage. Senator West saw me approach, and his expression shifted from confusion to recognition. He knew my role here. I was the federal official required to verify the compliance documentation. This was procedural, part of the formal process. What he didn't know was what I was about to say. I stepped up to the podium and the room gradually fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, confused. I was supposed to be in the background, processing paperwork, not interrupting the announcement. Commander Alpert stepped up beside me, a statement in itself, the presence of federal authority supporting federal authority. "Senator," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying through the room with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in their mind, "on behalf of the Federal Protective Service and the Compliance Verification Division, I must formally disqualify Stoneguard Elite from consideration for the Executive Wing Security Upgrade contract." The room erupted. Whispers, gasps, the sound of shock rippling through the crowd. I held up a hand and the room quieted. The disqualification is based on 2 factors. First, catastrophic system integrity failure related to their signature encryption product, the Titan Core Matrix. This system has failed to meet CVM.4.2 regarding dynamic encryption key updates. Second, severe ethical breaches regarding potential conflicts of interest between the contractor and government officials involved in the contract evaluation process. I placed the compliance verification matrix on the podium, showing the assembled crowd the detailed technical specifications and the empty signature block at the bottom. The signature block that was supposed to confirm absolute system integrity. "The required signature for the final verification of system compliance," I said, "belongs to the chief technical verifier assigned to this matrix." I pulled a pen from my inside jacket pocket. "That position," I said, pausing for exactly 1 beat, "is me." I signed the form with deliberate, visible slowness. Each letter of my name was clear and unmistakable. Caleb Stone, Chief Technical Verifier, Federal Protective Service. The room seemed to hold its breath. I looked directly at my father and I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand absolutely and completely that I had won. His face went gray. He literally swayed in his seat, and Arthur reached out instinctively to steady him. I watched as my father seemed to shrink, to fold in on himself, as if the weight of reality was finally too much for even his carefully constructed persona to bear. "Sentinel Security," I announced, "is the hereby designated winner of the Executive Wing Security Upgrade contract." Michelle Chin, the CEO of Sentinel Security, stood up in stunned silence, understanding that she'd just been handed a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a contract that would position her firm as the nation's premier security contractor for the next decade. Then, just as the room was beginning to process this announcement, Commander Alpert stepped forward. Before the crowd, before the cameras, before everyone who mattered, he pulled me aside and whispered something into my ear. "Senator West needs to know about his wife." I nodded once. I walked directly to Senator West, and I handed him a folder containing every piece of documentation I'd collected. The receipts, the flight logs, the photographs, the evidence of his wife's affair with Harold Stone, laid out with the precision and clarity that only someone with my technical training could have assembled. I watched the senator's face as he opened the folder. I watched as his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to absolute, white-hot fury. He looked at me, then at my father. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice carrying through the room with the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you are hereby permanently disqualified from all federal contracting opportunities. Additionally, I am personally requesting that the Department of Justice investigate potential conflicts of interest regarding your involvement with my family." He turned to the assembled crowd. "This announcement is concluded. Sentinel Security is the designated contractor. Any further inquiries should be directed to the Federal Protective Service." He left the podium. I walked away from the podium slowly, deliberately, aware of every eye in the room tracking my movement. My father was no longer sitting in his chair. He was collapsed in on himself, his head in his hands, the picture of absolute destruction. Arthur was trying to help him, but my father was unreachable, lost in the moment where everything he'd built, everything he'd stolen from me, had crumbled to dust. I didn't feel triumph exactly. I felt something deeper and more complicated: clarity, justice, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. But I also felt something I hadn't expected: the weight of my own actions. I had destroyed my father. And yes, he had earned it. But I was the instrument of that destruction, and that was a truth I would carry with me. As I left the auditorium, Vivian was waiting for me in the hallway. She was holding a small envelope. "I got a call," she said, her eyes bright with tears and joy and confusion. "Someone from a bank. They said there was a significant deposit made to an account in my name. Something about federal assistance for displaced employees rebuilding their lives. There's enough money here for the bakery, Caleb. There's enough to make the dream real." I held her, and I let myself believe that perhaps not everything was tainted by my revenge. Perhaps some good could come from it. Vivian's bakery opened 6 months later. It was a small space in a neighborhood that wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The walls were pale yellow. Fresh flowers sat in vases on every table. The cases were always full of the croissants and tarts and delicate pastries that Vivian had dreamed of creating for years. On opening day, Commander Alpert came by with a box of her famous éclairs for his office team. He didn't say much, just, "You're talented. I'm glad you finally had the chance to show it." My mother came to the opening, and I took care of her medical bills with a career that no longer felt like a compromise. I was using my skills now, but I was using them in the service of the government, in the service of security that actually protected people. Sometimes Vivian would ask me about Stone Guard Elite, about what had happened to my father and brother. I would tell her what I knew, that my father had spent everything defending himself against the SEC investigation into his conflicts of interest. That Arthur had moved to another city and was trying to rebuild his career in some other industry. That Stone Guard Elite still existed, but it was no longer relevant, no longer a force in the security industry. "Do you regret it?" she asked me once while we were closing up the bakery for the night. I thought about that question for a long time. "I regret that it was necessary," I finally said. "But I don't regret what I did. My father taught me that power without accountability is just cruelty. I gave him accountability. I gave him the consequences he'd earned." "And the time bomb in the code?" she asked. "Did you really plan all of that years ago?" "Yes," I said. "I built something beautiful and I built something ugly into it. Both things were always going to be true. It just took me a while to understand when to let the ugly thing bloom." She squeezed my hand. "I'm glad the ugly thing bloomed," she said. "Otherwise we wouldn't be here." Years later, long after Stone Guard Elite had faded into obscurity, I was invited to speak at a cybersecurity conference about the evolution of federal compliance standards. I was on a panel with Michelle Chen and several other security experts. We were discussing the future of encryption protocols, the importance of dynamic key updates, the ways that elegant system architecture could serve both genius and justice. During the Q&A session, a young man in the audience raised his hand. "I heard a story," he said, "about a security engineer who was pushed out of his company by his family, and then years later he brought down that company by designing federal standards that they couldn't meet. Is that a real story?" The other panelists looked at me. Michelle smiled, a knowing smile. "It is," I said simply. "What would you say to someone in that situation now? Someone whose family has betrayed them?" I thought about my father's voice in the federal security complex lobby. "He's just a civilian. He doesn't belong here anymore." "I would say," I said slowly, "that being a civilian isn't a weakness. It's a position you occupy until you decide to occupy a different one. And if you're smart and patient and absolutely clear about your principles, you can eventually occupy a position of such authority that no one can ever dismiss you again." I paused. "But more importantly, I would say this. Revenge is a road, but it's not a destination. The real victory isn't in destroying your enemy. The real victory is in building something beautiful in the space where destruction happens." I looked directly into the camera, knowing this was being recorded. "My wife owns a bakery now," I said. "She creates things that make people happy. That's what mattered. Not the revenge. The bakery." Years after all of this, after the scandal had faded from the news cycle, after my father had essentially disappeared from public life, after Stone Guard Elite had become nothing more than a cautionary tale in cybersecurity textbooks, I received an unexpected visitor at the FPS office. It was my brother Arthur. He'd aged significantly. The polish was gone. The charm seemed exhausted. He was just a man now, stripped of everything that had made him impressive. "I wanted to apologize," he said, not sitting down, not expecting to be welcomed. "I wanted to tell you that I understood what I did. I understood what I didn't understand at the time, which is that you were actually brilliant and I was actually nothing. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry." I looked at this broken man, this echo of my father, and I felt something shift in my chest. "I accept your apology," I said. "That's all?" he asked, seeming surprised at the simplicity. "That's all," I confirmed. "Revenge against you wouldn't mean anything. You're not the one who needs to face consequences. You're just a person who didn't know any better. He left quietly after that. I never saw him again. But I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully grasped before. My father was the real villain in this story. My father and the systems that had allowed him to be so. And I had done what I set out to do, not just to take revenge but to demonstrate that no system, no matter how carefully constructed, can survive if built on a foundation of lies and inequality and cruelty. The time bomb I'd built in Stoneguard's code had detonated perfectly. But the real time bomb had been my own patience, my own clarity, my own absolute commitment to building something beautiful in the space where destruction happened. A year later, the Federal Protective Service offered me a promotion to Deputy Director of Compliance. I accepted, and I spent the next 15 years setting the standards by which federal security contractors were evaluated. I designed systems that couldn't be gamed. I created standards that demanded both technical excellence and ethical integrity. I built a structure where genius alone wasn't enough. You also had to prove that you could be trusted. It was the best revenge I could have possibly imagined. Not destruction, but the architecture of a system that would never allow someone like my father to operate again. And every time a contractor was disqualified for failing to meet the standards I'd set, I thought of my father's voice in that federal security complex lobby. He's just a civilian. He doesn't belong here anymore. I belonged everywhere now. And the presidential seal on my badge would never let anyone forget it. If you've made it this far, you understand, respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my father's cruel dismissal, calling me a civilian, or by the money Arthur stole from Vivian's bakery dream. My story proves that silence was a weapon, letting me embed the Titan Core kill switch and design the impossible CVM right under his arrogant nose. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your boundaries don't make you difficult. I didn't beg for my job back. I simply executed the system failure and walked onto that stage carrying the presidential seal of my true authority. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. Your worth was never in question. Have you ever had to prove your worth to a family that underestimated you? Share your story in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe.